The Forgotten Lake. It was the summer of 1987, in a small, sleepy town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and the nearest city was a good hour's drive away. A place where secrets could be buried deep, both in the ground and in the minds of the townsfolk. For three kids, Jake, Tommy, and Billy, it was the summer that would change everything. It was the summer they discovered the lake. Jake was the oldest of the trio, at 12 years old. He was the leader, one who always came up with the wild ideas that Tommy and Billy would follow without question. Tommy, a year younger, was the brainy one, the thinker. He was the type who would ask questions when Jake didn't, though he rarely got any satisfying answers. And then there was Billy, the youngest at 10. He was small for his age, quiet, and often the butt of the others' jokes. But he was fiercely loyal, and no one else could touch him if Jake and Tommy were around. The summer days were long, and the boys filled them with adventures in the woods that bordered their town. They built forts, climbed trees, and sometimes even dared to venture into the old mines that everyone else avoided. But there was one place they had never gone before. A lake, hidden deep in the woods, just on the edge of the forest. The older kids whispered about it in school, calling it the Forgotten Lake. A place where strange things happened, a place to be avoided at all costs. But Jake wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, especially when he could see the gleam of fear in Tommy's eyes whenever the lake was mentioned. Billy, as usual, was along for the ride, trusting Jake implicitly. So, one hot, sticky day in July, the three boys set off into the woods, determined to find the lake that no one ever talked about. They walked for what felt like hours, the trees growing denser, the air cooler as they moved deeper into the forest. The usual sounds of the woods, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, gradually faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Even Jake, who prided himself on never being scared, began to feel uneasy. "Maybe we should turn back," Tommy suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake scoffed, though his voice was less confident than usual. "What, are you scared? It's just a lake, Tommy. Nothing to be afraid of." Billy, trailing behind, said nothing, his eyes darting around nervously. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. It was as if the forest itself didn't want them there. Finally, they reached a clearing, and there it was, the lake. It was smaller than they had imagined, more of a large pond than a lake, but it was undeniably beautiful. The water was dark, almost black, and perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the gloomy sky above. The air around the lake was cooler, almost chilly, despite the oppressive summer heat. "See? It's just a lake," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. He picked up a rock and tossed it into the water, watching as it skipped once, twice, and then sank with a soft plop. The ripples spread out across the surface, distorting the reflection of the trees around them. Tommy and Billy watched in silence, their unease growing. There was something about the lake that wasn't right, something that made their skin crawl. But Jake, ever the leader, wouldn't let them back out now. "Come on, let's check it out," he said, stepping closer to the water's edge. Tommy hesitated and followed, and Billy, not wanting to be left alone, reluctantly trailed behind. They stood at the water's edge, peering into the murky depths. The water was so dark they couldn't see the bottom. Something about it was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. "Look," Jake said suddenly, pointing at something just below the surface. Tommy and Billy leaned in closer, their eyes straining to see. At first, it just looked like a shadow, but then it moved. Slowly, lazily, like a fish gliding through the water. "Is that a fish?" Billy asked, his voice tinged with awe. Jake grinned. "Maybe, or maybe it's something else." Tommy frowned, his curiosity getting the better of him. "It's too big to be a fish, and look how it's moving. Fish don't move like that." Billy shivered, stepping back. "I don't like it. Let's go home." Jake turned to him, his grin widening. "What's the matter, Billy? Scared of a little fish?" Billy flushed, embarrassed but still uneasy. "It's not that. Just feels wrong." But Jake wasn't listening. He was already pulling off his shoes, rolling up his pants. "I'm gonna catch it," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Tommy hesitated. "Jake, maybe we shouldn't." But Jake was already wading into the water, the coldness of it making him gasp. It was deeper than he had expected, coming up to his knees after just a few steps. He glanced back at Tommy and Billy, who were watching from the shore, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. "Come on, you guys. Don't be such wimps," Jake called out, taking another step deeper into the water. But as soon as he did, something changed. The air around the lake seemed to grow even colder. Trees on the far side of the lake bending as if blown by a sudden wind. The water rippled, though there was no breeze, and a low, ominous hum began to vibrate through the air. "Jake, get out of there," Tommy shouted, his voice panicked now. But Jake didn't move. He was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror as he stared down at the water. It's got me," cried out, his voice trembling with fear. Billy screamed, but it was lost in the sudden roar of the wind that came out of nowhere, whipping around them with a fury that sent the trees shaking and the water churning. Tommy ran to the edge of the lake, reaching out a hand to Jake, who was struggling against something unseen below the surface. "Grab my hand," Tommy shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Jake reached out, his hand trembling, but just as their fingers brushed, he was yanked back into the water, force that sent him splashing under the surface. Tommy screamed, falling to his knees at the water's edge, frantically searching the dark water for any sign of his friend. Jake was gone. The water was still again, the wind dying down as suddenly as it had appeared. The lake was calm, as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't just swallowed their friend whole. "Jake! Jake!" Tommy screamed, tears streaming down his face as he pounded the ground in frustration and terror. But there was no response, no sign of Jake. The lake remained eerily silent. Billy, pale and trembling, was too terrified to speak. He backed away from the water, his eyes wide with horror. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to get help." But Tommy didn't move. He was still staring at the water, as if hoping Jake would suddenly resurface, laughing it off as some kind of joke. Deep down, he knew Jake was gone. The lake taken him. When they finally made it back to town, breathless and terrified, no one believed them at first. The sheriff, grizzled old man named Hank, dismissed their story as the wild imagination of kids who had wandered too far into the woods. But when Jake didn't come home that night, a search party was organized. They searched the woods for days, but there was no sign of Jake. The lake, when they finally found it, was just as the boys had described, dark, still, and unsettling. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of what had happened. It was as if Jake had simply vanished. The town was never the same after. The story of the forgotten lake spread, and soon, no one dared to go near it. The woods around it were declared off limits, and the lake was left to its dark secrets. But the nightmares began soon after. Tommy and Billy, the only ones who had seen what happened, were haunted by visions of Jake, his face twisted in terror, calling out to them from the dark water. They heard his voice in the wind, saw his reflection in the water whenever they looked too closely. And then, one by one, the other kids who had known Jake began to disappear. First, it was Sarah, a girl who had a crush on Jake. Then it was Mike, the boy who had teased Billy for being scared. Each one vanished without a trace, the only connection being that they had all known Jake. The town fell into a state of fear and paranoia. Parents kept their children close, warning them never to go into the woods, never to speak of the forgotten lake. But the nightmares continued, spreading like a disease through the town, until it seemed that everyone had seen the lake in their dreams, felt its cold pull. Tommy and Billy, now the last of the trio, were left to live with the guilt of what had happened. They had tried to forget, tried to move on, but the lake wouldn't let them. Called to them in the night, a dark, whispering voice that promised to reunite them with their friend. It was the fall of 1988, just over a year since Jake had disappeared, when Tommy made up his mind. He couldn't take it anymore, the nightmares, the guilt, fear. He had to go back to the lake, had to face whatever it was that had taken Jake. Maybe, he thought, he could find a way to bring him back, end the nightmare once and for all. Billy tried to talk him out of it, tears in his eyes as he begged his friend not to go. But Tommy was resolute. "I have to do this, Billy. I can't live like this anymore." And so, one cold October night, Tommy left his house and made his way through the woods. the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches clawing at him as he pushed forward. But he didn't stop, not even when the wind began to howl, carrying with it the faint sound of Jake's voice. The lake was just as he remembered it, dark, still, and silent. The air was colder here, the water reflecting the pale light of the moon. Tommy stood at the water's edge, his heart pounding in his chest, fear clawing at his throat. "Jake?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, only the soft lapping of the water against the shore. But Tommy could feel it. Presence, the cold, malevolent force that had taken his friend. It was watching him, waiting. "I'm not afraid of you," Tommy said, though his voice betrayed him. He took a step closer to the water, then another. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, swirling around him with a ferocity that made his teeth chatter. He didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. "Give him back," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Please, just give him back." The water rippled, a small wave lapping at his feet, and then, slowly, something began to emerge from the depths. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape rising from the water. But as it drew closer, Tommy could see it clearly. Jake, his face pale, his eyes hollow, his body soaked and lifeless. Tommy's breath caught in his throat, tears welling up in his eyes. "Jake," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. But the figure before him was not his friend. It was something else, something dark and twisted, wearing Jake's face like a mask. It smiled, cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down Tommy's spine. "Tommy," it whispered, its voice a mockery of Jake's. "Come join me." Tommy stepped back, his heart racing, but the thing that looked like Jake moved closer, its eyes locking onto his. "Don't you want to be together again, just like before?" it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Tommy shook his head, backing away from the water, but it was too late. The thing lunged at him, its cold, wet hands grabbing him, pulling him towards the water. Tommy screamed, struggling, but its grip was too strong. The water was icy, numbing his limbs as it pulled him under. And then, as the darkness closed in around him, Tommy heard a voice. A voice that wasn't Jake's, but something older, something ancient and malevolent. "You will never leave," whispered, its voice echoing in his mind as the water filled his lungs, drowning out his screams. The town never found out what happened to Tommy. They searched, of course, but like Jake and the others, he was never found. The lake remained, silent and still, a dark secret hidden in the depths of the woods. Billy, the last of the trio, left the town soon after, unable to bear the memories that haunted him. He never spoke of the forgotten lake again, but the nightmares followed him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the friends he had lost. And so the lake remained, forgotten by the world, but not by those who had lived through its horrors. It waited, patient and silent, knowing that someday, someone would come again, drawn by the same curiosity, the same fear. And when they did, the lake would be ready. The Cursed Hollow. 20 years ago, before I became a seasoned nurse with stories of my own, I was just another curious young woman, eager to learn and unafraid of the unknown. I've seen things that defy logic, things that cling to you long after you leave the room. But there's one story that haunts me to this day, a story not just of death, of something far worse. I first heard this story from a colleague, an older nurse who had worked in the most remote parts of the country. One late night, when the hospital was quiet and the only sound was the distant hum of machines, she shared with me a tale so chilling, it still makes my skin crawl. It was a story of a small, forgotten village deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where something evil once took root. It was the fall of 1998, and the medical team was sent to a secluded mountain village to conduct a health survey. They were preparing to open a new medical center there, and my colleague, who I'll call Sarah, was among the volunteers. The village was isolated, reachable only by a narrow, winding dirt road that cut through the dense forest. Sarah and the team were welcomed by the village head, older man named Henry. He had a gruff demeanor, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, a mix of fear and resignation. He led the team to the small infirmary, a simple wooden building that had seen better days. "Stay here," Henry said, his voice low and rough. "If you need anything, I'll be in my house." The team leader, Dr. Stevens, a man in his late 40s with a calm, authoritative presence, nodded. He asked Henry where they could find herbs and other local remedies, and Henry assigned a young woman named Lily to assist them. Lily was quiet, almost too quiet, and she avoided eye contact as she guided them around. Later that day, as the team was setting up their equipment, a commotion broke out outside. Voices were raised, and the sound of a woman's desperate cries echoed through the village. Sarah and the others rushed outside to see what was happening. A woman, disheveled and hysterical, was kneeling in the dirt, pleading with Henry's wife Martha. "Please let him go. He's not himself. He's sick." Martha's expression was one of cold indifference as she tried to shoo the woman away. But when she saw the medical team, her face hardened. "Go back inside," she snapped. Dr. Stevens stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" The woman on the ground looked up, tears streaming down her face. "My husband, please, you have to help him. He's dying." Henry appeared, his face a mask of anger. "This is none of your concern," growled. "The man is possessed. We have our own ways of dealing with it." "Possessed?" Dr. Stevens repeated, incredulous. "We need to see him. Now." Henry's eyes flashed with something dark, but he relented. "Fine," spat, "but don't say I didn't warn you." The woman, who introduced herself as Emily, led them to a small shack on the outskirts of the village. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, and even the birds seemed to avoid this place. As they approached, Sarah could feel a chill creeping up her spine. Inside the shack, the air was damp and heavy. In the corner of the room, a man was tied to a bed, his body shivering despite the warmth of the room. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, sunken, and filled with a terror that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "This is my husband, Tom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "He's been like this for weeks. It started with a small wound on his head after he came back from the woods, but then he changed. He started having these fits, screaming about bugs crawling inside his skull. He's not the same man anymore." Dr. Stevens approached the bed cautiously. Tom's breathing was shallow and his body was covered in sores, some of them oozing a dark, foul-smelling liquid. His eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment they locked onto Sarah's. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, as if something had reached out from those empty eyes and touched her soul. "Please, you have to help him," Emily begged, clutching Dr. Stevens' arm. "He's dying." Dr. Stevens nodded, his face grim. "We'll do everything we can," he said. But there was a note of doubt in his voice, one that Sarah didn't miss. As they left the shack, Henry and Martha were waiting outside, their expressions unreadable. "I told you," Henry said. "He's possessed. There's nothing you can do." "We'll see about that," Dr. Stevens replied, his tone brooking no argument. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The image of Tom's hollow eyes haunted her, and she kept hearing his faint, desperate whispers in the darkness. She could almost feel the bugs crawling under her own skin. The next day, the team began treating Tom with what little resources they had, but nothing seemed to help. His condition only worsened, and soon he was thrashing violently in his bed, screaming about the bugs, the horrible bugs. Sarah could see the fear in Emily's eyes as she watched her husband slip further away from her. Henry and Martha were no help. They refused to let the team take Tom to a proper hospital, insisting that the problem was spiritual, not physical. Instead, they brought in a man named Old Joe, a local shaman who claimed to have the power to drive out the evil spirit. Old Joe was an imposing figure, tall and gaunt with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He wore a necklace of animal bones and carried a staff adorned with feathers and charms. He entered the shack without a word, his expression grim. The team was forced to stand back as Old Joe began his ritual. He chanted in a low, guttural voice, waving his staff over Tom's convulsing body. Sarah watched in horror as Tom's eyes rolled back into his head, his body arching off the bed as if something was trying to rip its way out of him. Emily was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching Sarah's arm so tightly it hurt. "Make it stop," she begged. "Please, make it stop." But there was nothing they could do. The ritual went on for what felt like hours, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs and the sound of Old Joe's chanting. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Tom collapsed back onto the bed, his body still and silent. "It is done," Old Joe said, voice weary. The spirit has been driven out." But as he spoke, old winds swept through the shack, and Sarah felt a deep, primal fear grip her heart. Tom's eyes fluttered open, but they were no longer empty. They were filled with something else, something dark and ancient. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. Tom was not free. Over the next few days, Tom's condition deteriorated rapidly. His sores spread, turning black and necrotic, and a foul stench filled the shack. Emily refused to leave his side, even as the other villagers began to avoid her, whispering about the curse that had befallen her family. The medical team did what they could, but it was clear that Tom was beyond saving. Infection, whatever it was, had spread too far. His body was shutting down, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But then, something strange started happening. The sores on Tom's body began to pulsate, as if something was moving beneath the skin. Sarah watched in horror as tiny, wriggling shapes pushed against the surface, trying to break free. Dr. Stevens ordered everyone out of the shack. It was too late. The sores burst open, releasing a swarm of tiny black insects that filled the air with a deafening buzz. Sarah and the others fled, but Emily stayed behind, screaming as the insects swarmed over her. By the time they managed to get back inside, it was too late. The shack was empty, save for the lifeless bodies of Tom and Emily. The insects were gone, leaving behind only the grotesque remains of their hosts. The villagers were in an uproar. They blamed the medical team for bringing the curse upon them, and Henry was quick to fan the flames of their anger. He insisted that the only way to appease the spirits was to leave the village and never return. Dr. Stevens argued, but it was clear that the villagers were beyond reason. They were terrified, and fear had a way of making people do desperate things. That night, as the team packed their belongings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The village was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel road. But then, as they reached the edge of the village, they heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees. Sarah froze, her heart racing as she scanned the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the shadows of the forest looming over them. "Let's go," Dr. Stevens urged, his voice tight with fear. But as they turned to leave, they saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were the villagers, but they were no longer human. Their bodies were twisted and deformed, their skin covered in the same black sores that had claimed Tom and Emily. Sarah screamed as the figures lunged at them, their mouths open in a silent, agonized wail. They ran, but the creatures were faster, their claws tearing at their flesh as they tried to escape. One by one, the team fell, their screams echoing through the night. Sarah could hear Dr. Stevens calling out to her, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. She ran, her lungs burning, her legs trembling with exhaustion. But no matter how fast she ran, she could feel them behind her, their hot breath on the back of her neck. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run anymore, she saw it, a small clearing ahead, bathed in the pale light of the moon. She pushed herself forward, desperate to reach the safety of the light. But as she stepped into the clearing, she realized too late that it was a trap. The ground gave way beneath her, and she fell into a deep, dark pit, the walls lined with jagged rocks and bones. She tried to climb out, but the walls were too steep, too slick with blood. She could hear the creatures above, their guttural growls filling the air as they circled the pit, waiting for her to tire. And then, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she heard a voice. A soft, whispering voice that sent chills down her spine. "You cannot escape," it said. "You belong to us now." Days passed, and the villagers returned to their homes, first seemingly lifted. Sarah was never seen again. Some say she was taken by the spirits. Others say she was buried alive in the pit. The truth is far worse. For deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there is a place known as the Cursed Hollow, where the trees grow tall and twisted, and the air is thick with the stench of death. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of her screams, echoing through the woods, as she begs for release from the darkness that has claimed her soul. But there is no release, no escape from the horrors of the Cursed Hollow. For once you enter, you become a part of it. forever trapped in the nightmare that haunts those dark and twisted woods. And so the story of the Cursed Hollow became a cautionary tale, whispered among the villagers who knew better than to venture into the woods. But for those who didn't listen, who thought they could outsmart the darkness, they found themselves lost, never to be seen again. For in the end, the Cursed Hollow always claims what it is owed. As Sarah finished her story, her eyes distant and hollow, I realized that this was no ordinary tale. It was a warning that some places are better left alone, some things are better left forgotten. But it was too late. The darkness had already claimed me, just as it had claimed her. And now as I sit here, writing this down, I can hear them. The whispers, the growls, the sound of claws scraping against the door. I know they're coming for me. And I know that when they do, there will be no escape. For the darkness never forgets, and it never forgives. It only waits, patiently, for the next soul to claim.